Okay, welcome back. So now we understand the visual literacy components and principles. We're now going to look at how we combine these into our visualizations and to create charts based on graphical symbols as you see on the screen here. So there are four key types of graphical symbol. We have lines, points, linguistic symbols, and pictorial symbols. Now you'll see graphs made up of a variety of these, as we'll show you throughout the slides. But generally these four are the four main components of any graph. Let's start off with points. Well, if we just look at a simple scatter graph, say of temperature, maximum, and minima over time, we can see that the points show exactly what you expect them to. They show you on an XY plane where a given day or time or month, I think it's monthly data this one, month lies on these axes. And it's just a simple point, a block of pixels which are turned white, the sample, yeah? We could also show this via a line. So instead, I could draw a regression line through them. You see in the red bar here, this shows that, instead of showing all the scatters individually, I could show it on a line. If I wanted to add even more information, I could include a linguistic symbol like the R value or the R squared value for the given regression, just to add a bit more emphasis on here's the regression and it is strongly correlated if you need that much information. Depending on your audience, you might want to include these sort of additional statistic coefficients. And then finally, we could add, just an example here, a pictorial symbol, like an arrow, a big red arrow pointing upwards, right? You can't miss that. It's very obvious, and it's very easy for the reader to go, oh, clearly it's increasing. They don't need a linguistic symbol. They probably don't even need the scattering on there. They could just look big arrow, big line, sorted. I now get the meaning of this graph. So how do we combine these into these four items into being able to essentially create these dashboards and to differentiate between different types of data? So we're going to carry on with graphical symbols activity number 1, but for the video purposes we're going to move straight on to graphical variables. So we've just spoken about graphical symbols and how these can be used to show different types of data. We're now going to look at the 7 types of graphical variable. So this is how you can vary those symbols to show either more meaning in the data or different types of data, different clusters, any sort of differentiation you want to make, like we saw on the tube map earlier. Excuse me, where we saw the lines with different colours for different routes around the map. So the first one, and the most clear one as we just discussed, was position. So an XY plane or XYZ plane can show a point, and that could tell you quite a lot of information about that given point. So here we see a bunch of points, as I mentioned earlier, and they're all lined up, and they tell us a story about the data as a whole, but individually they also tell us that these are the months which have sat X, Y, and Z in this plane. Next up, we can use size. So here is a map of, I believe this is coronavirus outbreaks I think this was taken mid-April last year, I could be wrong there, but the bigger the shape, or the bigger the circle, the more, I believe this is the more deaths there were per capita. So you can see in the US, it's quite a big circle, meaning they got more deaths per capita than, say, Russia, or Mongolia, or China. We can then also use shape. So here is some other variants on that weather data we saw earlier. So we got the temperature minima / days of frost on the left and temperature maxima on the bottom. And we see the triangles are different to the circles, right? So the triangles are showing something different to the circles, and I think in this case they're showing days of frost, and the circles are still showing that temperature minimum. Ideally you don't want a joint y-axis, but for the purposes of this, it shows different shapes can work. We can use different colours, so value, hue, saturation, transparency, whatever you feel will suit your needs. For example, on this COVID dashboard from the UK government website, about the percentage of people which have been vaccinated against COVID-19, we see that the different colours here, the different shadings of these squares, show us how much of the population meets each of these 3 criteria. So, for example, the dark green, the booster or third dose, is the amount of population who's had a third dose of the vaccine. Second dose in a slightly lighter green, then a first dose is even lighter, and then we got the grey boxes for people who don't match any of this criteria. So again, it's just another way of varying the data, varying the way in which we're showing this information to our user to incorporate different meaning. We can then use texture. So as we spoke earlier, we had the London tube map and we had different texture in the lines. Whereas here what we're showing is, okay, so we got 2 regions which are textured out, so they're sort of emphasizing those regions. And this region in the north northwest of the UK here, this sort of diagonal hatching matches B, so we know that B is the same region as is highlighted on the original map. So it's a way of drawing a link between the two. We could then use blur, so you could blur different shapes depending on, I don't know, if you're predicting how foggy it is outside, you could have an icon which is blurry. And similar with speed, you could have a wind variable like we saw earlier. Or alternatively, if you are doing a video presentation, you could use the literal meaning of speed and speed through an animation or something like that. Okay, so those are our 7 graphical variables, and we've seen the 4 graphical symbols. So let's move on to graphical symbols activity number 2. And for the video purposes, I'm going to skip over this now. But if there are any questions, you have my email address, you know my office. I do have some drop-in sessions where you're welcome to come and ask me any questions. And if you do want to read any further, highly recommend the Brian Kennedy talk here, as well as a book provided just below. Thank you.